On the morning they found the body, the detective assigned to the case had no idea she would eventually be pointing the finger at a fellow officer, someone who had sworn the same oath to protect and serve. There are murders that shock a community. There are murders that shake a police department. And then there are murders that do both simultaneously while exposing the rot that can hide behind a badge. The case of Ann McManus is all of these things at once. A story about obsession, betrayal, abuse of power, and the painstaking investigative work that ultimately brought a killer to justice. A killer who, for most of his adult life, had been law enforcement itself. This is not a story that unfolds cleanly. It doesn't follow the neat arc of a crime drama where evidence accumulates in logical order and the guilty party makes a single fatal mistake. Instead, the investigation into Ann McManus's death is a story of confusion, misdirection, institutional reluctance, and, ultimately, extraordinary detective work that peeled back layer after layer of deception, exposing a man who had spent years using his badge as a weapon and his knowledge of police procedure as a shield. Ann McManus was not the kind of woman who was easy to forget. By the accounts of those who knew her, neighbors, friends, co-workers, family members, she was sharp, warm, resilient, and deeply private. She had carved out a life for herself that was, by most measures, ordinary in the best possible sense. A steady job, a modest home, a close circle of people she loved and who loved her back. What made Ann's story extraordinary was not who she was in the eyes of the world, but who she was in the eyes of one man, a police officer who had become fixated on her, convinced that their relationship, whatever its precise nature, entitled him to something she was no longer willing to give. That officer's name would eventually become synonymous with abuse of trust, the weaponization of law enforcement tools, and premeditated murder. But in the months and weeks before Ann's death, to the outside world he was simply a cop, a colleague, someone people trusted. The most dangerous predators are the ones who carry credentials, who know exactly how an investigation works, who know exactly what evidence to avoid leaving behind and what to plant. Ann had reportedly been trying to distance herself from this man. Friends would later tell investigators that she had spoken about feeling watched, feeling followed, feeling uneasy in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She had confided to at least one person that she was afraid, that the situation had escalated beyond what she could manage alone. Whether she formally reported her fears to authorities, and if so, what happened to those reports, would become one of the most painful and consequential threads of the entire investigation. She was found dead at her residence. The initial call came in as a welfare check, the kind of unremarkable dispatch that officers respond to dozens of times a week. Neighbors had not seen her. There was no answer at the door. The scene, when officers entered, told a far more violent story than the calm exterior of the home suggested. Ann McManus had been killed, and whoever had done it had not done so in a moment of blind rage. The scene showed evidence of deliberation, of someone who had thought carefully about what they were doing and how they would walk away from it. In homicide investigations, the first 48 hours are almost sacred. Evidence degrades. Witnesses forget. Alibis calcify into something harder to crack. Investigators know this, which is why the opening hours of any murder case are treated with the kind of focused urgency that doesn't leave room for politics or personal loyalties. But from the very beginning of the Ann McManus investigation, something was off. The officers who initially responded to the scene were professional, thorough, procedurally sound. The crime scene technicians who followed did their jobs with precision, but when the name of a potential person of interest began to surface, quietly, cautiously, almost reluctantly, the atmosphere inside the department shifted in a way that even those involved would later struggle to describe clearly. When the suspect wears a badge, the investigation doesn't just get harder, it gets politically dangerous, loyalties fracture. People start choosing sides before any evidence has been weighed. The officer in question, Ann's killer, as the evidence would eventually prove, was known to his colleagues. He wasn't a ghost or a stranger on the periphery of the department. He was present, active, embedded in the daily rhythms of law enforcement in a way that made his potential involvement not just shocking but institutionally uncomfortable. To seriously investigate him meant seriously investigating one of their own. The early stages of the investigation were marked by a tension that seasoned homicide detectives would later describe as palpable. There were those who pushed hard to follow the evidence wherever it led. There were others who were slower to accept what that evidence might be pointing toward. This internal friction, the human resistance to confronting the possibility that a colleague could commit such an act, would cost the investigation time. And in murder investigations, time is the one currency you cannot recover. The lead investigators began their methodical work. They canvassed the neighborhood. They documented the crime scene in exhaustive detail. They collected physical evidence, fibers, biological material, trace elements, and sent it to the forensics laboratory. They began building a timeline of Ann's last hours, working backward and forward from what they knew, constructing a framework within which the truth would have to fit. Among the first significant findings was the question of access. Who had known about Ann's home? Who had been to her residence? Who had the combination of motivation, opportunity, and knowledge to commit this crime and then potentially navigate the investigative process that would follow? The answer, emerging slowly and uncomfortably from the early evidence, kept pointing in the same direction. Forensic investigation is, at its core, a discipline of patience. It does not reward haste. It does not accommodate assumptions. It demands that investigators follow the physical evidence with the same rigor they bring to their own breathing, automatically, continuously, without the luxury of stopping. The forensic team working Ann McManus's case were meticulous. The crime scene had been staged to some degree, something that became apparent only after careful analysis. Objects had been moved. The body had been positioned in a way inconsistent with the trajectory of violence. Someone had spent time in that room after Ann was dead, rearranging details in an attempt to create a different narrative about how she had died. A staged crime scene is both evidence and confession. It tells investigators not just what happened, but that the killer knew they would be looking and tried to fool them. This staging became one of the most important early clues. Most crimes of passion, the kind committed in uncontrolled fury, do not involve post-mortem rearrangement. Killers who panic flee. Killers who are emotionally overwhelmed don't spend additional minutes carefully positioning a body, adjusting evidence, constructing a false scene. The deliberate staging pointed unmistakably towards someone with specific knowledge, someone who understood evidence collection, who knew what investigators would look for, and who had attempted to redirect their attention. Biological evidence collected from the scene was submitted for DNA analysis. In the 1990s and early 2000s, depending on the precise timeline of this case, DNA technology was evolving rapidly, and investigators were increasingly able to extract meaningful profiles from trace amounts of material that would previously have been invisible to them. The results from the Ann McManus case would eventually prove crucial, but they would take time. Everything in this investigation seemed to take more time than anyone wanted. Meanwhile, investigators began constructing a detailed portrait of the suspect's movements. Phone records were subpoenaed, financial records were examined. Investigators spoke quietly, carefully, deliberately off the record at first, to colleagues who had observed the suspect's behavior around Ann. What they found was a pattern, a documented history of contact, of surveillance, of behavior that, in retrospect, made the trajectory toward violence feel almost inevitable. The suspect had used law enforcement databases to look up information about Ann. This finding, when it emerged, was explosive in its implications. Police databases, the same tools designed to help officers track criminals, verify identities, and protect the public, had been weaponized against the very woman the system was supposed to protect. He had used his access to monitor her, to know her movements, to know her address, to know things about her that she never consented to share with him. He wasn't just a murderer who happened to be a cop. He was a murderer because he was a cop, because the badge gave him tools no civilian predator could have accessed. This discovery shifted the nature of the investigation fundamentally. It was no longer simply a homicide case. It was a case about the corruption of institutional trust, about the catastrophic consequences of unchecked access to power, about what happens when the system designed to protect people is turned against them by someone operating from inside it. Investigators began pulling together everything they had: the forensic evidence from the scene, the DNA samples awaiting analysis, the phone records showing contacts and gaps in contact, the database access logs showing what information he had pulled on Ann and when, the testimony of colleagues who had seen or sensed something wrong, and the accounts of Ann's friends and family who had watched her grow increasingly frightened in the weeks before her death. Every murder investigation reaches a point of inflection, a moment where the evidence tips, where the gravity of what the investigators are building becomes impossible to deny, even for those who might prefer to look away. In the Ann McManus case, that moment came incrementally, not in a single dramatic revelation, but in the accumulation of detail after detail, witness account after witness account, each one adding weight to the same inevitable conclusion. Witness interviews were among the most challenging elements of the investigation. People close to the suspect, colleagues, friends within the department, were not automatically hostile, but they were guarded. Some were genuinely shocked and struggling to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the picture investigators were painting. Others were protective in a way that made extracting useful information difficult without tipping the investigation's hand prematurely. Outside the department, in Ann's personal world, interviews were both more forthcoming and more heartbreaking. Her friends described a woman who had tried to do everything right, who had tried to handle the situation with the man quietly, privately, without escalating to formal complaints, perhaps because she feared what a formal complaint against a police officer might look like. Perhaps because she had reasons to doubt that the system would protect her. These accounts, offered with grief and anger in equal measure, painted a picture of a woman who had understood her danger and had not been able to find a way out of it in time. She had been afraid. She had told people she was afraid. The most devastating question in the investigation, the question nobody could answer, was whether anyone with the power to stop what was coming had been listening. Investigators also focused intensely on the timeline of the night of Ann's death, accounting for every hour, every movement, every phone call and documented or undocumented contact. The suspect had an alibi. Of course he did. People who know how investigations work construct alibis the way other people buy insurance, methodically, in advance, covering against the most obvious lines of inquiry. But alibis, when examined with enough scrutiny, often contain seams. Inconsistencies that seem minor until they are placed in context. The alibi began to unravel, not dramatically, not with a single devastating contradiction that crumbled everything at once, but gradually as the timeline was cross-referenced against physical evidence, against cell phone tower data, against the testimony of individuals who had no reason to lie and every reason to tell the truth. The picture that emerged placed the suspect in proximity to Ann's residence during the window, when the medical examiner's office had determined she was killed. Cell phone records were particularly revealing. Modern investigations, and even those from the previous decade, rely heavily on the digital trail that mobile phones leave behind. Not just calls and texts, but the tower pings that record a phone's physical location at specific times. The record subpoenaed from the suspect's carrier placed his phone near Ann's home. The records he would later claim he had been elsewhere were contradicted by the data in ways that he, despite his law enforcement knowledge, had apparently not anticipated fully. This was the first major crack in his carefully constructed defense. It would not be the last. DNA evidence does not lie. It does not misremember. It does not become frightened under questioning or change its account based on social pressure. In the Ann McManus investigation, the forensic biology results would ultimately become the spine of the prosecution's case, the physical proof that anchored everything else investigators had built. The DNA extracted from the crime scene was processed by the forensics laboratory with the kind of painstaking care that such evidence demands. Chain of custody was maintained impeccably, something that would prove critically important when the defense later mounted challenges to the physical evidence. Every transfer, every test, every result was documented with a thoroughness that left no room for legitimate procedural challenge. When the profile came back and was run against the law enforcement database, the same database the suspect had access to, the same system through which he had monitored Ann, it returned a match. The DNA collected from the crime scene matched the suspect's profile. Biological material that should not have been in Ann McManus's home on the night she died was traceable, definitively, to one man. He had spent years learning how evidence was collected, how DNA was processed, how investigations built their cases. In the end, he had left behind the one thing no amount of procedural knowledge can fully eliminate: himself. The forensic results did not exist in isolation. They were corroborated by the cell phone data that placed him in the area. They were corroborated by the testimony of witnesses who had documented his obsessive behavior toward Ann. They were corroborated by the database access logs showing he had used law enforcement tools to surveil her. They were corroborated by the physical evidence from the staged crime scene, evidence that pointed towards someone with specific knowledge of investigative procedures. Each piece of evidence, individually, was significant. Together, they were overwhelming. The investigators who had been building this case, many of whom had worked through weekends, through holidays, through the kind of institutional resistance that can quietly suffocate an investigation, now had what they needed to make their move. The question was no longer whether they could prove what had happened. The question was how to proceed with an arrest that would send shockwaves through every law enforcement community it touched. Arresting a fellow law enforcement officer is not a simple procedural matter. There are operational considerations, ensuring the arrest is clean, safe, and unimpeachable. There are institutional considerations, coordinating with internal affairs, with command staff, with the district attorney's office that will ultimately try the case. And there are the deeply human considerations that nobody in the department talks about openly, but everyone feels: the weight of turning on one of your own. The arrest was executed with precision. There was no dramatic confrontation, no chase, no moment of cinematic resistance. He was taken into custody in a manner that was, outwardly, entirely routine, but there was nothing routine about what it meant. A law enforcement officer being handcuffed for murder. The charge read like a mistake, the kind of thing you look at twice because the words don't seem to belong together. The moment he was walked through those doors in handcuffs, every officer watching understood something that would take the rest of the world longer to absorb. No badge makes a person innocent. No oath makes a person trustworthy. Our, unexamined, is just danger with credentials. The news of the arrest spread with the speed of something that people simultaneously needed to share and could barely believe. Inside the department, the reactions were varied and complicated. There was grief for Ann, yes, but also the complicated grief of an institution confronting its own failure to protect someone who had been afraid. There was anger. There was, in some quarters, a defensive impulse. The desire to argue that this was an isolated incident, an aberration, not a reflection of anything systemic. And there was Among those who had pushed hardest for the investigation to follow the evidence wherever it led, a somber, exhausted sense of resolution. The defense, assembled in the days following the arrest, was built primarily on challenging the physical evidence. If the DNA could be questioned, its collection, its handling, its integrity through the chain of custody, then the prosecution's case could potentially be destabilized. The defense team was experienced and thorough. They hired their own forensic experts. They submitted the evidence to their own analysis. They scrutinized every documented step in the forensic process for any procedural deviation that might give a jury reason to doubt. They found very little. The investigators and forensic technicians who had worked this case had, perhaps precisely because of the sensitivity of who the suspect was, been even more painstaking than usual. They had understood from early in the investigation that every step they took would be scrutinized. That defense counsel would look for any seam, any gap, any opportunity to argue contamination or misconduct. They had closed every gap they could find,